Marxism is taking over the United States. Will it succeed? We're going to try to answer this question in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, we've got to understand the Marxist view. To do this, let's go back in history to 1820. During the 1820s, there was a massive boom. The banks in Britain and in France were investing heavily in Latin America, in emerging markets. But it became like a bubble, a financial bubble, just like we see today. So much so that they started investing in countries that didn't even exist. That's right. They had economic and financial shysters back then, just like we have today, where these people were selling bonds from countries that they just made up out of thin air. As a result, the banking system had a crash. This created a depression in the 1830s. The people back then had no idea how the financial system worked. They didn't understand central banks. They didn't really even understand the banking system. But as human beings, we always try to make sense of the world around us. Unfortunately, we do this often with a lack of information and a limited understanding of what really happened. So in the 1820s was a perfect example of this. The people in the Depression didn't blame it on the banking system or investing in Latin American countries that didn't exist. They blamed it on the king. They blamed it on the Jesuits. All of these entities or people that really had nothing to do with the real core problem. Why? Again, because people try to make sense of the world around them, but often in doing so, they make huge errors. Another example of this is the Aztecs or the Mayans, the group in Central America that literally used to sacrifice human beings. And I'm not sure why they did this, but let's just say it was to make it rain. They thought in their minds when they were making sense of the world around them that if they needed it to rain, there was a drought for 5 months or something like that, that they literally needed to kill someone to appease the gods to make it rain. Another great example in modern day times would be CNBC. Whenever you see the stock market down by even 50 points, CNBC will have some explanation as to why. Stock market down 50 points on coronavirus fears. Really? Are you sure that that's why the market is down by only 50 points? Maybe, maybe not. But again, it goes back to this point that you need to remember for the entire rest of the video to make sense. And then let's remember lastly that what we see today is what was taught in universities 10 and 15 years ago. So what we can see being taught right now in the universities is what we can most likely expect over the next 10 years, over the next 15 years. And these professors and people coming out of the universities, regardless of their belief systems, have a massive reliance on cognitive dissonance. If you don't know what this is forming a strong belief system, and anything that you see just enhances the particular belief system. It's a self-defense mechanism we have as human beings to try to alleviate the feeling of pain. And we do this to the degree that even if we see facts that completely contradict our belief system, we'll totally ignore them or we'll spin them in order to prove the original things that we believe. So let's get into the Marxist principles for the video. First is the production of goods and services. This is at the core of their belief system, which is actually a good thing. You'd think the Keynesians would take the same approach. But the Marxists also believe that people are kind of compartmentalized into specific groups. And you don't have one person moving from one group or group A over to group B. It's like if you're born in group B, you're there for the entirety of your life. If you're born in group A, you're there for the rest of your life. And it doesn't really work that way. But again, this video isn't about debunking Marxism. It's about explaining it and trying to answer this crucially important question. They also see people as chess pieces that behave the exact same way every single time. So if you're in group B, well, then you always do these things. If you're in group A, then you always do these things. And each group's actions they take are completely predictable. Also, they see transitions from one system to the next system, and each system is superior because theoretically it can produce more goods and services more efficiently. If you read Marx, he was actually very complimentary to capitalism from the standpoint it was far superior to feudalism and it was able to advance society forward. But what he believes is capitalism gets to a certain point where it can't grow any further and it starts to feed on itself and destroy itself. So he thinks that going back to the production of goods and services, that feudalism did a poor job, capitalism did a much, much better job, but at a certain point, capitalism won't go any further. It'll start to destroy itself. That's the point where communism needs to come in and take the efficiency to the next level. And when I mean efficiency, I mean the production of goods and services, making the entire society that much richer. This point where capitalism can't take it any further, this line in the sand, is referred to by a lot of Marxists as late stage capitalism or late capitalism. And if you've never heard this term, I challenge you to go to Twitter, type in hashtag late capitalism, and you will be amazed at how popular this term has become over the last few years. But let's go back to understanding how the Marxist sees this transition from one system to the next system based on the production of goods and services. To do that, an easier illustration is if we start with the productive capacity, that's how much goods and services that system is capable of creating, whether it's feudalism or capitalism. So we start with feudalism, let's say, and capitalism comes in, it grows the economy, grows it even further, but at a certain point it hits its limit. It cannot continue to grow because the productive capacity has been reached. This is when Marx, obviously this is Karl Marx right here, holding a sign saying, "I love communism." But he's saying, listen guys, the system can't grow. And in order for society at large to become richer, we need to abandon the current system and move to something superior. But to reiterate, even Marx himself admits that you can't go from feudalism to communism. That doesn't work. You have to go from feudalism to capitalism, then to communism. And a lot of people don't understand that. Let's look at it illustrated another way just to make sure we're all on the same page. The Marxist sees it as this timeline moving forward. We start with a certain system, and this system runs into a brick wall where it cannot grow any further. That's when you need revolution. The two groups battle it out, and the winning system, the superior system, needs to take over. When they went from feudalism to capitalism, it was the aristocracy battling the capitalists. The capitalists needed to win. But the peasants really didn't have a say in it, or the proletariat. But when you go from capitalism to communism, this is another battle of the classes, the two groups of people, but they're just two different groups. Now you've got the capitalists battling it out with the workers. The workers need to win this battle, this revolution that brings in communism and takes society as a whole to the next level of wealth and the next level of social justice. And you may be saying to yourself, yeah, George, I get it, but isn't it obvious? If you go back and look at Russia, can't the Marxists or the communists see that it was a complete failure? Well, maybe you and I would see that, but again, you need to look at it from their vantage point to be able to answer the question of the video. And their view isn't the fact that Russia failed because of communism. Their view is Russia failed because they didn't allow capitalism to actually take hold for long enough. So it wasn't that communism was a failure, it's just the timeline they got wrong. It's very important, and we'll address that again in step number 3. And before we move any further, I want to give a huge hat tip to Jeff Snyder and Emil Kalinowski. I'm basing this entire video on their most recent podcast. So if you haven't seen their show, Making Sense Eurodollar University, make sure you check it out on iTunes or on YouTube. Now let's dive into the details of how this last stage of capitalism plays out in the mind of the Marxist. They see prices dropping first, ironically enough, because the capitalists are so darn efficient. And they'll admit that. So the prices drop, then these businesses start to go bust because their margins get squeezed. The businesses that are left form monopolies. Once they form these monopolies, they jack prices up and they start to lower wages. This increases the wealth gap dramatically, which means the capitalists have fewer and fewer buyers. If they have fewer buyers, they have less profits. And at a certain point, their profits shrink so much that they look for other areas to expand their wealth. The only other option is then to speculate in financial assets, creating these giant booms and busts. Hopefully this sounds pretty familiar to you. To understand this better, let's go right to a video clip explaining this stage of capitalism. And I want to point out this video was done very, very excellent, but it was done by an actual Marxist. It wasn't some Austrian trying to translate what Marxism is saying. Kind of like I'm doing right now. So let's cut right to the video.
Just as the forces of production were hampered by the feudal relations of production once before, now too the productive forces in capitalist society have developed to a point where they are constricted by the capitalist relations of production. The productive power of society is now being held back by the capitalist order, and I'll show you what I mean by this. Under capitalism, production is carried out for private profit. As products are produced more and more efficiently, their cost falls and can be sold cheaper to steal buyers from other competing capitalists. Unfortunately, as competing capitalists catch up and manage to sell their products at this cheaper price, the profit rate has fallen, and there is a scramble to lower costs again. Innovation now becomes the enemy of the capitalist in the long run. To fight back against this tendency of the rate of profit to fall, capitalists can monopolize markets, artificially restricting supply and hiking prices well above their cost, completely putting to waste the productivity of society. They can also monopolize intellectual rights, holding back the general adoption of innovative technology. But none of this really matters when the vast majority of workers don't have the money to buy the products. Every capitalist seeks to lower labor costs as much as possible, but still wants buyers. Debt and the hyper-exploitation of the global south can help bridge this contradiction, but it's not particularly stable. As productive industries become less and less of an attractive investment due to their slim return rates, capitalists increasingly swarm to invest in unproductive financial markets and speculative bubbles. Resources wasted in these financial schemes and bubbles are resources that could have been invested to further technological development. When these speculative bubbles periodically pop and capitalists no longer see profit to be made, capitalist society falls into economic crisis.
Like I said, it was a very well done video, but think this through. If you were a person with limited understanding of the financial system, central banks, and how the economy really worked, and you had limited information, and you were trying to make sense of the world around you, you would see this video and you'd say, yeah, that's exactly how it works. That's what I see playing out today right in front of my eyes, especially if I look at a chart of the wealth discrepancy in the United States. We go back to 1989 all the way to 2015. On the left, it goes from 20% up to 45%. The bottom 90% of the population back in 1989 had almost 35% of the wealth. Today, it's almost 20%. It's really gone down dramatically. Where the top 10%, their wealth has increased over the exact same time frame. So they look at what Marx was saying, they say, aha, everything I learned in university was spot on. And since that time, the belief system that I've grown by being in this echo chamber of social media, well, that's obviously correct as well. It goes right back to what Marx was saying. The wealth gap would increase when we get to late stage capitalism. We're seeing it play out in the data and the charts. And let's not forget what happens is the capitalists get to a point where they can't squeeze the worker anymore. What do? They start speculating, creating booms and busts. Look at this chart. This is obviously where late stage capitalism started to set in. At this point, the capitalists couldn't squeeze any more margin out of their workers. They started to speculate. This creates the booms, the bust, boom, bust. And then the Fed steps in, saves capitalism, prints money, which takes the stock market to all-time highs before crashing before the cerveza sickness. But of course, the only reason the economy and the market has crashed is because capitalism is so unstable. This is the view of the Marxist, and it's crucial we see the world through their eyes to understand the probabilities of Marxism taking over the United States. Step number 2, Marxist reality check. And I know most of you throughout the entire step number 1 were saying, George, that's not because of capitalism, that's because of the Fed. And of course, you nailed it, spot on. What the Marxist sees as late capitalism is really early Fed fiat currency, a manipulation of interest rates and inflation. I really want to focus on inflation for a moment for those viewers who might be new to the channel. Since the Fed was set up in 1913, inflation has increased by over 2,000%. If we only had a healthy type of deflation instead of the inflation, and notice I said a healthy deflation, this is what we would have with a free market capitalist system. But if we only had a healthy type of deflation, the middle class and the poor would get richer and richer and richer. But that is for a separate video. Going back to the wealth gap and the boom and bust, this is created by the Fed and the central banks. They even admit it. To dive into this further, let's go straight to a video from the Bank of England explaining the purpose of quantitative easing.
The aim is to boost spending to keep inflation on track to meet the 2% target. Alongside its decisions on asset purchases, the Monetary Policy Committee continues to set bank rates each month. The bank purchases assets from private sector businesses, including insurance companies, pension funds, high street banks, and non-financial firms. Most of the assets purchased are government bonds. There's a large market available, so the bank can buy substantial quantities of assets fairly quickly. The Bank of England's injection of money into the economy works through different channels and has a variety of potential effects. When the bank buys assets, this increases their price and so reduces their yield. That means the return on those assets falls. This encourages the sellers of assets to use the money they receive from the bank to switch into other financial assets, like company shares and bonds. As purchases of these other assets start to increase, their prices rise, which pushes down on yields generally. Lower yields reduce the cost of borrowing for businesses and households. This, in turn, leads to higher consumer spending and more investment. Of course, higher asset prices also make some people better off, which provides an extra boost to spending on goods and services.
So let's go over the basics. The Fed goes to all the primary dealer banks, it buys their treasuries, it prints up new bank reserves. It's not really money, but for the sake of this example, to keep it simple, we'll assume it's typical dollars circulating in the system. The primary dealer banks take that additional money, they go into the stock market, they buy risk assets. At the same time, this expands the balance sheet capacity, meaning they can give more loans to hedge funds and financial institutions that can take the additional purchasing power, go into the stock market as well, raising it to all-time highs. It increases the wealth gap and it exacerbates the boom and bust of the business cycle. But the Marxist sees this whole process as an extension of capitalism, when you and I know it's the complete opposite of free market capitalism. Everything on this list, whether it's businesses going bust from monopolies, we have lower wages for the workers, speculation, it's not because of capitalism, it's because we have a reduced amount of capitalism and free markets. But the main takeaway from step number 2 is all the tools the Fed has at their disposal, the money printing, the artificially low interest rates, and the quantitative easing, all the things that you and I know create wealth inequality, and these financial bubbles, like the dot-com bust, the real estate bubble, and the everything bubble, in the eyes of the Marxists, they see this as more and more and further proof of late-stage capitalism. Step number 3, the end game. Let's go back to step number 1 very quickly and remember that we as human beings need to make sense of the world around us. Often we do it with very limited understanding, limited information. The universities, basically what was taught 10, 15 years ago is what we see in society today. And what's being taught in the universities currently is what we should expect in the future. This breeds a lot of cognitive dissonance and entrenched beliefs. Third is a lot of people, especially Marxists, believe that you are born into a specific group. So if you're a worker, you're going to stay there your entire life. You never have the flexibility, the mobility, the opportunity to go from being a worker to maybe being an employer or a business owner. And even if you are a worker, you never have the opportunity to make more and more income. Why? Because we're in late stage capitalism, and the only way capitalists can continue making more and more profit is if they pay you less and less money. This takes away people's hope for a better future for themselves and their children. And if you take away people's hope, they start to take drastic measures. This, in and of itself, is very, very powerful. We also need to realize this is a global phenomenon. It's happening in different countries in different ways. And this is crucial that you get your mind around this so you can understand the gravity of the problem we're dealing with. To dive into this further, let's go to the genesis of this entire whiteboard video. And that's the last podcast from Jeff Snyder and Emil Kalinowski.
The Chinese, when the Soviet Union fell in on itself in the early 1990s, they sent teams of researchers into the former Soviet Union to try to identify what went wrong in communist Russia in order to not become the next communist Russia, to fall in, at that time, a whole bunch of dominoes across Eastern Europe. And what they decided was exactly what we're talking about, Emil. What they said was Marx was right in that you can't impose communism on a society before it reaches terminal wealth. That's the big mistake the Soviets made. They thought they had achieved that kind of a plateau. It turned in on themselves. It turned in against themselves. Therefore, the Chinese weren't going to make the same mistake. So, communist China in the early 1990s went on essentially a capitalist spree, a limited capitalist spree, which reinvented China. It reinvented the Chinese economy in the same exact way, turned a largely agrarian, backward economic system into a modern industrial powerhouse. And so, again, the idea is you use capitalism, and then once it reaches its final stages, once it gets to its point where it can no longer move the ball forward down toward the goal line, that's when the revolution, that's when true communism kicks in. Revolutionaries show up and start confiscating everything, all in the name of the greater good.
It goes right back to what we were saying in step number 1, where the Chinese looked at the Russian failed experiment with communism, and they didn't come to the conclusion that communism didn't work. They came to the conclusion that the Russians just implemented it too early, before capitalism could grow the economy large enough to where the communists could come in, take over, and take society to the next level, this utopian communist state where there's social justice, everyone is equal, but everyone is getting equally rich because of the increased productivity with supplying goods and services. Of course, this is all total nonsense, but it goes to show you that the power of cognitive dissonance and entrenched beliefs can take hold not only at the individual level, but at the group and country level as well. But let's take it right back to the question of, will Marxism take over in the United States? I think we have gone into this communism doom vortex that starts with the economy continuing to get worse, as you and I know, because of the Fed and a lack of capitalism. But then the Fed will come in, use their tools, which will exacerbate the problems of wealth inequality and these boom and bust cycles. The Marxists see this as an increased need for revolution. They've got to step in and take action now, because the capitalists will destroy everything they have built since the days of feudalism. That's the way the system works according to Marx. So this justifies using any means necessary to take from the capitalists everything they have built and move society forward. This is why I think we'll see increased riots, looting, social unrest, social pressures on individuals and corporations, where they'll be forced to conform to a specific narrative. This is going to reduce freedom of speech and information and understanding of what's going on in the world around them, just like we talked about in step number 1. But because they have a reduced understanding, they have to make sense of the world around them, which is going to make them more entrenched in their belief system. It's going to increase the need for cognitive dissonance. And because we have less and less freedom of speech information, that means the Marxists are going to become more and more and more driven by Marxism and thinking that they're actually right. And we as individuals who understand the benefit of free market capitalism aren't going to be able to convince them, because in my opinion, sooner or later, we're not even going to be able to talk about it. And as an example of how ridiculous things are getting, editor, go ahead and pull up the Wikipedia article on DC, Washington, DC, becoming a state. For most of the modern 1980 to the present statehood movement, the new state's name would have been New Columbia. Although Washington, D.C. Admission Act of 2020 now refers to the proposed state as Washington Douglas Commonwealth. So what they're saying is Christopher Columbus was such a bad guy that they're just going to get rid of everything in the United States that ever referenced his image or his name. Let me be clear. I'm not saying that Christopher Columbus was right or wrong. You shouldn't take down his statues. You should. That's a completely separate debate. What I am saying is the best disinfectant for bad ideas is sunlight. You don't want to sweep it under the bed and pretend it doesn't exist. This entire video is a perfect example of that. I think Marxism is a horrible idea, but I'm not ignoring it. I'm not burning every single book that references Marxism. I'm talking about it so you can understand just how bad of an idea it is as well. And I would suggest every single social justice warrior out there doing the exact same thing. But where does this end? Are we going to change the name of the entire country because you believe it's rooted in things that are evil? The insanity just continues to grow as our personal liberties and freedom of speech continues to shrink. But to answer the question, will Marxism take over the United States? I would say no, in the sense that we're not going to call it Marxism or communism just because of the history of the United States. But in practice, I think it will. The private ownership will always be there, but it'll be a facade. Yes, it may have private ownership, but taxes and regulations are going to continue to increase so high that the people that actually own the business aren't going to be in control at all. They're definitely going to socialize the profits through these higher taxes, but the government will really have control over the businesses. But I think it'll be a different way. It's not going to be a dictatorship like we saw in China and in Russia. I think it's going to be a mob control. The mob is going to control the government, and they're going to do this through social media. So as an example, the government or a corporation will throw out a trial balloon, let's say the next Nike ad, and depending on how the mob on social media receives the ad, that's how they're going to determine whether or not that ad is released. And the government is going to remain at the mercy of the mob because it's still going to be a democracy. So the means of production won't be in the hands of the private sector. The means of production will be in the hands of the mob. But there is some good news. I want to remind everyone that even the Marxists see a place in the world for capitalism, just not in the developed world. So if you're an investor, maybe you're someone who's looking for more personal freedom, or maybe you are a capitalist yourself, why don't you consider going to an emerging market, a developing country, where even the Marxists see capitalism as being beneficial? You can go there yourself. You won't be bothered with all of this nonsense. You can improve those societies. You can improve those countries themselves, while at the same time, the developed world continues to decline. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.